Yes, that's right. We are alive. Get back to 1969. I am your host, Jeff Mader, for this Beatles podcast, where we are covering the three-part series, Peter Jackson's Get Back from Disney Plus. We're covering the second episode here, guys, and we have two special guests this week. Uh, Joining us, who didn't join us last week, we'll bring him on in. Jake Shields. Let's bring him on in. Jake, how are you?
Can't complain. How are you tonight, Jeff?
Good, good. Ready to talk about the Beatles. You didn't join us for the first episode, so before Josh joined, Josh is just having some technical issues. Before he joins us, let's just get your thoughts on the first episode since you weren't here last week. What did you make of the Twickenham portion of this three-part series, and what were your like initial thoughts and takes on it?
Uh, well, I guess seeing the second episode, it kind of gives you a good perspective on how things change when they move from Twickenham to the studio. Um, yeah, I think overall the first episode, it had a very, it's almost similar to like how the studios were. Like the Twickenham studio was kind of big and artificial, and it was kind of dark and with the spotlights. It was very, it kind of set the mood for how things kind of went as the episode went along, and ultimately how it finished. Um, Whereas you'll see in the second episode, they move to the studio. It's much brighter, much more intimate, and it's a much kind of better atmosphere.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that was part of the problem was this whole idea that since Twickenham was the place they filmed the Hey Jude music video, they're like, oh,
Yeah,
let's go there, and Ringo's going to be shooting his movie there, so let's just go there. And it wasn't really a good idea. And once they got there in the first episode, you kind of saw like, oh, this is not good acoustically. Like it was okay for to do a music video, but which they probably had backing tracks and everything
yeah.
set up for them. Whereas like to actually like rehearse and record an album in an empty
It,
warehouse is probably not a good idea.
it almost seemed like it was forced. It was almost like, all right, you guys go there. We're gonna film this, and you do your thing. And it was very, yeah, very artificial. It was very forced. It wasn't kind of natural with what they're used to.
Yeah, and which is so it's like it's the band in their element, but not. It's like the middle of January, and I'm guessing it's pretty cold in London in January. Like they're in this empty, uncomfortable steel warehouse. I just don't think it was conducive for what the band, like you just said, was used to, what
Mm.
fed their creativity. I think they're used to being kind of, comfortable by now. They've been the Beatles for, especially like the recording Beatles, for like a good 2+ years at this point. And they're not touring anymore, and they're just used to kind of being like sheltered. And I think that, if you're gonna like record them and film them and do all this stuff, I think it's probably much more conducive for them to be in the studio and not be in this like movie warehouse. So I understand why they didn't like it. But so when this episode starts, the second episode here, Jake, we kind of see like it's Ringo and Paul show up to
Yeah,
Twickenham, and like John Lennon again, as always, is late or is in bed and doesn't want to show up, and then George is like left the group, and we saw at the end of the last episode, he's like, I'm done, see you later, you know. So it's like, what do they do? Like, is this the end of the Beatles? Is this kind of just like a temporary setback? They don't really know. Okay, one sec. We just gotta add in Jake, your brother, Josh. His camera's not working, but we'll add him in as the voice of God here. Josh, how are you? Or have you watched the second episode of Get Back? And what are your thoughts? Quick thoughts.
Uh, it was very different than the first episode, and I'd say it was different in a lot of good ways. I think we got to see a little more of their personalities. It wasn't just kind of Paul yelling at everyone and writing songs the whole time. So I enjoyed it. And I haven't watched this third episode, and I'm really excited to watch that. So it obviously did its job.
Yeah, I haven't watched the third one yet either. I've been kind of, I watched these two back to back, and then I was like, that's 5 hours of this documentary. And I kind of got to a point where I need to take a break. Even as a huge Beatles fan, I was like, I can't do
yeah.
it straight through. So, so go ahead, Jake.
That's the mistake I made. I watched all three episodes in like a 48-hour span.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like information overload where I kind of like saw everything, and it's almost like your brain can't like take all of it in. So like it actually happened a few times where I'd watch a couple of the episodes, and then I'd like read something on Reddit or on Twitter about, oh, this happened in episode one. I'm like, I don't even remember that. I got to go back and look at that because like my brain didn't even register it because it was way too much at one time.
Yeah, it's not. This documentary is not extremely edited. It does allow a lot of breathing time between segments,
Yeah.
and you see them joking and goofing off a lot, and so that part is not. I could see another director who's not Peter Jackson, who's not as big of a Beatles fan as he is, cutting a lot of this stuff and just be like, that's not needed, that's not necessary. Kind of like the original Let It Be film.
Yeah.
But this one, like, okay, so we get into this whole. Josh, we were explaining to I was explaining to Jake before you hopped on. This whole episode starts with just Ringo and Paul show up at Twickenham. And they're like, okay, what's going on? And then that's when John Lennon does show up because George has left the group. And then we get the whole hidden microphone in the flower pot conversation. Josh, what did you make of that conversation? Did you think did you think that this was a conversation that went well, or do you think it was a needed the thing? Like, was a cool scene behind the glimpse of knowing they're being filmed?
Yeah, like it was interesting to see how they talked when it was just the two of them, not just that they didn't know they were being recorded, but in this all the other studio scenes there's a bunch of random people around, so they're obviously kind of acting their they're putting up their walls a bit, whereas in this situation the conversation was very choppy, like obviously the recording, but just in general they're kind of talking naturally to each other as kind of friends. I thought it was cool. It was it was really hard to hear, so it was like you're reading along trying to make sense of what's being said, but it was definitely good to get a little bit of it definitely explained the feelings that it seemed like the other band members were kind of annoyed with Paul, which I don't think came off as much in the first episode other than George. So it was good that we kind of got, John saying that and Paul kind of not even denying it, saying, yeah, I get it, guys. Like, I really want to do this. So that was good to see.
Yeah, I think it was really fascinating the way Paul looked at himself, especially in that conversation where he was like, I've always looked at like you're the boss and I'm secondary boss. And then I like John kind of goes, well, not always. There are songs where you literally become like the maestro almost. And you're telling, you play like this and I, these are my arrangements, is basically, and very defensive. And I think even John got to a point where he was like, he kind of says in the conversation, like, screw it, like, do what you want to do. And, he's like, I don't even fight you enough. Jake, what did you kind of make of that conversation, the flower pot conversation?
Well, I thought it was important because to that point, they weren't really telling each other exactly what they were thinking. So it was kind of that good kind of venting back and forth, just to kind of get it out in the air, which I think was really important to them, getting back together, and then in turn getting George back, that they kind of put everything out in the open.
Yeah, like that's a good way to put it, because I see a lot like what you guys were, what Josh was just saying, like they're always constantly around people. They're constantly having to be on and be, their personas, and kind of always, laughing it off, joking it off, and trying to keep it light. But when you do that, you avoid getting what's really in your subconscious, or even your, like just getting it out, getting what you really think out in the open, and airing your grievances and actually having a conversation about what's really bothering you. And you can tell that a lot of this is bottling up and is ready to explode.
Like if, say, they knew they were on camera and they knew they were being recorded, if this discussion happened on camera, it would have been much more kind of passive aggressive, kind of joking, like, oh, you are always taking control, blah blah blah, you're Mr. Boss Man, whatever. But then just having a really like serious back and forth, which I think was important.
Yeah, like, and I'm guessing that's kind of what occurred in the first meeting that they have at Ringo's house, when they start like and Paul and Ringo are kind of talking about how Yoko spoke for John the whole time. So I think if they don't have this flower pot conversation, all they really get is what Yoko apparently was saying for John. Like, Josh, what do you make of that whole Yoko dynamic here that's going on with the Beatles, and especially with Paul?
Yeah, I think this episode gave us more of a glimpse into that. I think we actually discussed last week with when Dave was here that, the episode didn't really show Yoko as really being a problem. Like, yeah, she was always around, kind of just there, but, they didn't really say anything negative about her. She didn't really say anything negative herself. Whereas in this episode, we definitely saw, Paul made a few comments about her. He made that whole, Yoko sat on an amp line. And we did learn that she was the one talking for John at the first meeting at Ringo's house. So it obviously shows that when they're not being recorded, or they don't know they're being recorded, she's running sort of the show a bit for John, which I think, based on John's personality, which we really get to see in this episode, that makes sense. He seems like he's kind of just like a laid back, easygoing guy. He doesn't really care what's going on. And Yoko's probably that one who's kind of pushing him to make changes and things like that.
Yeah, and kind of like, yeah, pushing him to step out of what he knows in his comfort zones. And that's what a lot of, like, at the same time he's doing that primal scream therapy stuff with her, and trying to get, I think, a lot of his trauma out of him, through therapy, basically, in a way. But he's also kind of masking it with drug use. So there's a lot going on with John, whereas I feel like that's not really brought up a lot in this documentary. It's just shown. Like, there's one part when he does come in here at Twickenham. It's right after an interview that he did for, actually, I think, CBC. And you can go watch that interview. And if you watch that interview, like, him and Yoko are like out of it. Like, they are like, they're not like they are here in the documentary. Like, they're really like spacey if you go watch that interview. So here it's like, it's kind of different to see. I think it's really early in the morning when they're doing the interview, and that's probably why. And I think John liked to stay up really late and write songs, and that's probably also why, But you could see, like, the rock star lifestyle is kind of like weighing on all these guys, and they're kind of just had enough of this whole idea of this documentary, originally going to be a TV show. I just don't think it was a good idea. Like, I'm glad we have it now, but at the time, I think it was not good for their band. Jake, do you kind of see what I'm saying here, or do you kind of think, like, this was a good idea? If they didn't do this, they never maybe would have made Let It Be in Abbey Road.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, I think, like, their idea originally to make the whole TV series sort of documentary type thing was, well, obviously to make money. But again, you knew that they were going to cut a lot of stuff out. They weren't going to actually show how it actually was. It was going to be more like a glorified music video, look how great we are at making songs sort of thing. So like, I saw that part of it. But yeah, I think it's hard to say, because if they didn't do it, then maybe, like you're right. That maybe they don't come out with this album, or maybe the songs are different, or maybe it's kind of the whole changes the course of history of what happened. So it's kind of hard to say whether it was good or bad.
Yeah, no, for sure. I just think for the dynamics of their band, and I think the reason why is because, and the thing that they don't really speak about is the White Album. Now, some of them say that, like, I know Ringo and Paul both say that the White Album was like a really good time for the Beatles, but Ringo also left at one point, but he says that, like, a lot of them say that, even George says it in the first episode, like, oh, that was the only time I really, really got involved on an album. But John has also been, I know, quoted of saying that the White Album was when the break of the Beatles started to occur, because it was like, Paul, you go do your songs, John, you go do your songs, George is gonna do his songs and bring Clapton in and all this different stuff. And this is the whole point of this Get Back, is like, okay, we're gonna put the four guys back in a room and we're gonna make the music the way we used to. But they're changing as people here. I think you can clearly see here that, and Josh, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is like, you can see how, like, they all have their girlfriends or their wives. They're all kind of like living in comfortable houses and coming together. They're not living on the road. Paul speaks to this in this episode. Do you think that the dynamic is changing, and it's just like inevitable that this break's going to happen, and they can all see the writing on the wall?
I mean, I think so. Like, just relating it to my own experiences, and like what I see with anyone is, they became rock stars. They toured the world as rock stars. The Beatles became the biggest thing in the world, and now they're all kind of, okay, like, we've done this for 10 years. Let's they changed it up when they stopped touring, and now they've done several studio albums, and I think they want to do more with their lives, and maybe it's just not fun anymore, right? Like, it's obviously the fact that they're forcing themselves to make this album in a short period of time. It's almost like they don't want it. It's work now. They're not enjoying it. So they're trying to bring back, like you said, that magic, working together in a studio. But at the same time, some of the comments I heard in this episode, it's almost like they're doing it this way because they just want to get it over with, right? Like yeah, let's just record, the songs in the studio, and we don't have to go back and make all these changes, and then it's over in 2 weeks. Like, let's work through the weekend because I don't want to have to work an extra week. Like, they just want to get it done and get an album out, because I think they do all realize it's been a while since they've released anything. If they want to stay relevant, they have to release something, and this was sort of their way to force that to happen.
But that's what I find so strange, Josh, because the White Album was released November 22nd, 1968. So that is literally only 5 weeks before they started this. So,
okay,
it's not like, they've been sitting on, for 2 years, and they've literally pumped out 3 albums in like a year and a half period. But I think the thing is, it was their process that they had a problem with. That it was like the White Album, it was like, I know John said this, they were basically 4 individuals all making their own songs, and then they basically just threw them together and called it the Beatles. But it wasn't really the Beatles. It was, the individuals. It was the John Lennon song. It was the Paul song. So I think they were like, okay, we can't call ourselves the Beatles anymore if we're not actually the Beatles. So that's what I think this whole Get Back thing was about, was to actually start playing together again and force ourselves to play again and see if it works. And I think, Jake, what do you think? Like, do you think they're getting along? Do you think that they're like, is Paul like a big problem here, where he just wants his songs the way he wants it, and he's not being acrimonious enough to the other guys?
Yeah, well, I think that's always been the case. With Paul, he always seems to be kind of have his own idea, and that's how he wants it to be. He'll take input, but like, going back to the discussion on how they want, like, how they might break up because they all want different things, or their things are stale. I remember near the end of this episode when they're talking about how they can't do the live show anymore, the place they wanted to do it, it's too late to get it. Paul seems upset because he's saying, like, all right, so what are we doing? We're just going to sit here in the studio and record another album? Like, that's what we've been doing. Like, where's the payoff? Like, what's something different that we're going to do? Like, we're the Beatles. We have to keep innovating. That's kind of what his message was. And it seems like the other guys were fine with just, let's just pump out another album. So that's where I kind of think the difference is. I think Paul is trying to think, like, all right, let's push the envelope here. Let's keep evolving. The other guys are kind of more just like, all right, let's just, do the album, and that's great.
I think John, like, also was the one that wanted to perform, but like, there's no real foresight here, and I think they're letting, like, the director Michael Lindsay Hogg kind of have way too much say in, like, what they might or may not do. And so, like, and I think we saw it in the first episode where Paul's kind of like upset that, I don't want to be the boss. And ever since Mr. Epstein died, we've kind of like lost our captain, our rudder on our ship. And so I think it's just difficult for one of them to be like, no, this is what we're doing, because it used to be Brian, but now he's gone. And so it's hard for them to, like, no, you're wrong, or no, I'm wrong, or, like, all that kind of stuff I think is going on with them. So Paul's taking the reins a little bit, and I think it bothers, like, a George, or it bothers a John in certain moments where it's like, well, no, I don't want to do that because you want to do it, or like that kind of dynamic. But yeah, this whole timeline where we have, like, okay, Ringo's gonna go do a movie. John, like, you get, like, Josh just earlier said, like, they want to work through the weekend, get it done, and like, yeah, they're not really enjoying it the way they should be. They're not giving themselves the time to enjoy it. And I think that if they had given themselves a few months to, like, maybe make this album, I think the rooftop concert's great and everything, but I think they would have had a little bit more time to, like, come up with something even more incredible. But it was it was kind of like, yeah, like we know what's coming to an end. Let's get this over with. I'm kind of sick of your company. Is kind of how I feel about it in a lot of ways.
Well,
Josh,
well,
yeah, go ahead, Jake.
well, like I like you say that they aren't enjoying themselves. I think that they're enjoying being together and playing music. I don't think they're enjoying doing the actual work of
Right,
making an album.
right.
Like they seem to have a lot of fun messing around playing old blues songs
Yes.
and dicking around on the piano and on the guitar and making up stuff, but they're not having fun actually like, all right, we got to make sure we're in this chord and you got to come in there, and that seems like that's being the issue. But them just all the four of them being in the studio together messing around, that seems to be what they're enjoying.
Yeah, it seems painful when they're like working on, for instance, like I've got a feeling, I think I listened to it about 10 times in this episode. Like
Yeah.
they go through it a whole bunch of times, and there's a whole bunch of moments where it's like, no, do this or do that, or no, you're on A and then I'm going over here and going to D. Oh no, actually you're in the wrong spot. And you can just see, yeah, I agree with you, Jake, that
Well,
they're kind of like having a hard time with that work.
well, and again, when Billy Preston comes in, I think it's George who says, "You've given us new energy." And from then on in that episode, they're a lot more focused on the songs and what they're doing. Like it seems like that kind of gave them like, all right, we're set now. Like we can kind of rock these things out.
Yeah, Josh, what do you make of Billy Preston's arrival here? Is that kind of what they needed? Just another voice?
Yeah, like, well, that's funny. It's ironic that you say that because one thing I thought was weird is, I mean, obviously it's because of microphone choices and things like that, and they probably didn't expect to have a fifth guy. But you basically don't hear Billy Preston say more than 2 words in the entire episode. It would have been kind of nice to get a little more insight into his relationship with the Beatles, because from the video, it looks like they really get along. They laugh, they joke. They even made a comment about making him the 5th Beatle when he wasn't there, but we don't get to see any real interaction. We don't get any insight into their relationship. But I think that having him there, he's another professional musician that they knew from before they were super famous. They're telling him, we want your help recording an album. They're not just going to dick around when he's there because they'd be wasting his time. And I think they're all polite enough individuals, at least to other musicians, that they're going to work and they're going to record when he's there. And I think that, what Jake said makes sense. The days that he wasn't there, they didn't work as hard, and they did have a little more, conflict in guys, we got to get this done. There's a couple times where Paul kind of says like, everyone like quiet, we got to record this again. Like, whereas when Billy was there, it just seemed like they were doing it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because I think you're right that they're kind of on their best behavior when Billy's around, and it's like, even though like they're the Beatles and they're the boss even of their own record, that yeah, you're right that they're much more professional when he's around, and when he's not, yeah, there's a lot more of those old dynamics come back, and a little bit more you can see like the unresolved bickering that's going on underneath the surface. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, go ahead.
It reminds me of like, when you find out that this couple breaks up and you're like, oh, but they were like the perfect couple, because when they're around other people, they're acting all perfect and like, cordial to each other. And then as soon as they're home alone and the door closes, they're fighting all the time. That's what the Beatles are like. They're like a couple of 4, where when it's just the 4 of them, they're always, the fact that George can walk out on them one week and then, a week and a half later, they're all working together. That literally in my head reminded me of like a fight with like a spouse, where you can have this crazy fight and the next day you're best friends again. And I feel like the Beatles are like a couple. There's 4 of them, but when he's around, it's like, all right, we got to act well. There's another person here.
Do you know what it's kind of like, Josh? It's kind of like a curling team. There's 4 of them. There's 4 on a curling team. And there's definitely Ringo is definitely the lead. George is definitely the second. And then it kind of switches between who's the skip and who's the vice between John and Paul.
That'd be annoying.
Yeah, right. Which I think is kind of like the major problem in the band at this point, that John is kind of not the boss anymore. Paul kind of wants him to be the boss, but he's not really doing it. And so, Jake, do you kind of see those dynamics? Do you think like Paul's like, I kind of want to be the second in command, but you're not taking the reins of this band?
Yeah. I think that Paul doesn't want the responsibility. I think he wants to just kind of, like be a musician. Like that's why I think he's kind of struggling with like Epstein being gone and stuff like that. Like I think I don't know if it's in this episode or if it's in the next episode, but there's a lot of that kind of like, I want, just to play. I want to be a good band. I don't want to be bossing everyone around all the time. That's kind of a theme throughout the whole series.
Yeah, and I think before it was nice to have Brian Epstein be that person. They trusted him. He would be like, all right, boys, wear a suit. All right, boys, this is your show, and you're going to go play here, and you're getting on a plane here at this time, and you're going to go over here and play this concert, and then you're going to do this, and you're going to do that. And they were like, great. It was much better to have him be the bad guy. And now I think that was a big mistake that they made when he died, that they didn't get a new manager. They were like, okay, we're going to manage ourselves. And I think that was a mistake that they made. They should have hired somebody that they could trust to do it, but I don't think they ever found that person that they could trust. I think that's kind of what ends up breaking up the Beatles.
But again, in hindsight, say they hire a manager and it screws everything up even worse.
You might not get a Sgt. Pepper. You might not get a Magic Mystery Tour. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe the whole course of history changes. Maybe make one more album that sucks and they have more issues and then they break up then. Like it's one of those things where it could have been better, it could have been worse.
It could have been, yeah. You never know because history, you can't go back and change it. But I think that's interesting that they never did really find a manager. They do talk about in this episode about Alan Klein, which is, if you know anything about Beatles history, and I'm sure you do, Jake and Josh, that Alan Klein was kind of like a main fork in the road between the Beatles.
Which I would argue is the biggest factor in them breaking up is Alan Klein.
Yeah, Alan Klein and Paul wanting Linda Eastman's father to be their manager. After this album is when that whole argument starts to occur. Because they record Let It Be here, and then they're going to start to work on Abbey Road right after this, which is they start working on it in February. It's amazing how they just bust these albums out. I mean, like other bands, lucky to have 2 or 3 songs as good as one of these songs on these albums. And they're just incredible at like just pumping them out. Josh, like, what do you make of like just how fast and like their production level, even though they seem like they're goofing off all the time, they're just pumping out this music?
Well, one thing that I mean, it's really interesting watching this, especially like for me, Let It Be has always been kind of like, I didn't think it was a bad album. I know when it first came out, a lot of people were disappointed in it, which I think was more because it was the last album, but it's never an album that I, would not, it's not like Sgt. Pepper's or the White Album where I'll put it on and literally like listen to it from start to end. Cause it's just like, for me, those are just 2 great albums and they're so different.
Yeah.
Whereas, Let It Be has always been, okay, there's like 2 really like popular songs. There's 3 or 4 good songs. And then, it's kind of short. There's not much going on, but watching this makes me really appreciate the fact that they're also working on a lot of the songs that end up on Abbey Road. And it's almost like Let It Be is like the leftovers. And it's kind of crazy because a couple of like the songs that they were focusing on in this episode, at least, which was like 2 of Us, Dig a Pony, and I've Got a Feeling, like they're all really good songs. And I appreciate them even more watching kind of the process of them working, like watching them record I've Got a Feeling over and over, and just Paul's voice in that song. Like it's just so, I think it's awesome. And the fact that they can do that is, why I think what you said is so true. They just have such good production. They're literally writing these songs in a day, recording different versions of them, and then they're on the album.
Yeah, like they show you For You Blue in this episode where they actually show you the take that goes on the album. And I think
the part about For You Blue, which was interesting, is that how George was saying how it's kind of like a nice simple song. He's like, it's a 1-take wonder, but it could be a 4-take wonder, and it ends up being 4 takes, and they get it like right away.
Yeah, and the slide guitar that John's playing is awesome, and he knows it's awesome.
And the piano, how he wanted to make it like the bad piano, so they put the newspaper,
the honky
in it. Yeah, I like that part a lot, where they kind of showed like the quick, all right, let's knock this song out, and they just like, it was like boom, and they did it. It was really, really, really cool the way that they, especially the way the film kind of showed it.
And I noticed that a lot with George's songs, that like when they want to do his songs, like they can really pump them out. Whereas with I find with John and Paul's, it's like, no, we do this here, no, we'll do that here, or we should do this harmony bit, we should do this
And
melody bit, all the time.
and I think that's George knowing that they're not going to want to spend a lot of time on his songs. So I think he goes in with a plan of being like, all right, this is the song, and it's just like do this, do this, do this, do this, and we'll play it, and that's it. It's not let's try this, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this.
I would say though, in defense of especially Paul here, obviously I'm a big Paul fan. I think him and John are used to, they've always written together, like the fact that they've made a partnership, that all their songs are going to be together. It's not like they're hanging out after this studio session and writing songs together for the next day. And I don't think either of them is at this point in their career super used to writing songs from start to finish on their own. They're used to this process of trial and error together, whereas George, he's always kind of written his own songs. He's used to it. So basically it just sucks that George and Ringo have to sit through John and Paul doing their thing, coming up with these, like finalizing these songs.
Maxwell Silver Hammer.
Well, exactly. Like, first of all, I don't know. It's a fun song, but it's not a good song. And yeah, it's just funny how often in this episode you see that anvil sitting there in the corner of the frame, and they're all just looking at it all day, like, oh, we're gonna have to do that stupid song again.
Yeah.
So
Paul wanted that to be a single, and that wasn't going to happen.
That song's not for everybody. What's funny, you say that, Josh, that is Amanda's favorite Beatles song, and every time she says that, I'm like, I like it, but it's not nowhere near my favorite.
That's like your favorite Leaf being Nick Ritchie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
no, exactly. It shows Paul's got a lot of range, though, right? Like someone who can come up with Eleanor Rigby and then also Maxwell Silverhammer, like they're opposites.
Yeah, they're completely opposites. But in some ways, like okay, the Maxwell Silverhammer song, if we could just talk about it quick, it's basically like this, like honky tonk, but also kind of like a vaudeville style. But it's like they're also doing the whole like back. I feel like it's the most similar to like a Sergeant Pepper, where John's doing all the background vocals, and you have like, I don't know, it's like a dark song, but it's all happy, like so all those kind of things that I think Paul does really, really well is in that song. It's just like, it's kind of a, I don't know, it's not like
it's almost like if he kept it in his back pocket and maybe released it like 5 or 10 years later, after kind of working on it a bit and like figuring out exactly what he wants to do, he could have made it really good. But
yeah,
it just wasn't. It didn't really have the right like vibe to it, I guess.
It might have made a better Wings song.
Yeah.
Well, and I know there's a tape from like maybe later, like 1969, like later in 1969. It's like a famous tape where the Beatles are trying to make things work, and George and Paul and John kind of make the not an agreement, but they suggest maybe for future albums we just each write 4 songs individually. And I think someone makes a comment about, I think it's John, who says, nobody else liked Maxwell Silverhammer, so just don't do a song like that or something.
Oh yeah, and they also didn't really like Obla Di Obla Da, So like, there's a few songs that like stand out where, they worked on them over and over and over because they couldn't get them right too. I think that's the other part of the problem, is like what Jake just said. Like, if they had sat on some of these songs for a few years and then figured out what was wrong or what was right with them, they could have maybe polished and refined them. But like, they were like so good at just pumping out songs, and like, I think they're like, no, we've worked on it enough, and if you can't get it right within a month, then there's something wrong with the song. I think it's like, I know with Obla Di Obla Da, for instance, they kept trying to make that song slow, and then like there's a famous story where John walks in the studio and just starts pumping it, that fast piano part, that whole part was not originally how the song went. Like, it was supposed to go way slower, and he kept working on it and working on playing it over and over and over, and it just wasn't working. And it wasn't until John did that was how they kind of figured out what was wrong with the
Yeah, because
song.
it was originally supposed to be almost like a reggae type of like
Right.
vibe, like a nice slow, and then it did just probably obviously didn't sound right. Like, why would the Beatles kind of have like a reggae kind of
And
speed? So yeah, they kind of sped it up.
And the reason why it was the reggae vibe was because where he got that phrase from was this black guy that was with them in India who always kept saying obla da, man, life goes on," right? Like that was like the whole story. It was like so like I think that's why he wanted to do it that way, but then it just didn't work, you know. So I think when you look at the Beatles, sometimes it just needed another voice or it needed maybe a different perspective, but sometimes I think Paul, especially, has he's like, this is the way the song's going to be. This is how it's right in his head. And any good artist, I think, does that. Kind of goes, no, this is the way I look at it, is how I view it. And, just support,
Yeah. And there was actually an exchange in this episode. I can't remember. It was John and Paul, and they were saying, like, remember how we used to, when we first started, we go on tour, and every time we sung the song, it would be different, and we'd forget parts. And over, playing it 50 times in gigs, it would come out with the final version. And I think it was Paul who kind of said, yeah, but I like it better this way. Like, you just pick how you want the song to be, and you play it that way. And I think that's exactly what you were saying. Is it might be that if the songs evolved organically over time, we might end up with a better song than forcing it to work in a short period of time.
Yeah, I think like if they had toured, I think they would have done that more. They would have forced them to kind of play it on stage and then figure it out. And I think that's why bands love touring too, because they get to play the same songs over and over and kind of figure out, oh, okay, we could play it like that, or we could play it like this. So
yeah, I remember like when I was in high school, I went to a lot of old guy concerts. Like I saw like Alice Cooper and Van Halen and Motley Crue, and I thought it was funny. We would make jokes that it's because they couldn't do it the same anymore, but they would be playing songs that they literally probably played hundreds, if not thousands of times, and they would still do riffs and make changes and things like that at this point. So it's kind of cool, like that bands will do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've seen Elton John 2 times in concert, and he played a lot of the same songs, and he would play them a bit differently, And I think that's, if they don't, then they just get bored. It'd be like, making the same movie over and over,
It's not a science, it's an art, right? So it's going to be different every time.
It's a mundane thing.
Like cooking, not baking.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to describe it. Okay. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about the India stuff that they kind of like, where Paul was talking a little bit about all their footage that he was watching? He says he watched it the night before, and they come in and they go through a lot of the India stuff. Ringo said, I think at the beginning of the episode, the director asked him, "Did you like India?" He goes, "No, not really." What did you make, Jake, of all the India stuff that Paul and all the footage?
I thought it was interesting. I mean, that was obviously like not a turning point for the group, but it was kind of a change in their whole kind of vibe with the whole, especially like George getting into the whole Hare Krishna Hinduism. I think it almost that was kind of their change from being, the Beatles kind of boy band, kind of being their more on the edge sort of band. I thought it was interesting them especially just like them putting this in this documentary. It kind of shows where they came from into making a lot of these songs. But also that it seems like they recall it all as being kind of good memories too. With Paul talking about it, it seemed like it was actually a really positive time.
Yeah, like I think like George asks Paul, like, did you like it? Like because he's kind of talking about it in 2 ways. He's like saying like, oh no, like I really did enjoy it, but at the same time, it was kind of like you could tell Paul's a workaholic, and he was like, I'm not in the studio. I need to be in the studio. I got to get this out of me. Josh, like, did you kind of feel that way? Like it was like, I feel like George was almost a little bit offended in some of the ways he was talking about India.
Yeah, I mean, this episode was weird for me, like the whole George thing, because I felt like there was hardly any audio of George, and the video we see of him, like obviously the the documentary is very open with the fact that the video we're seeing doesn't necessarily line up with the audio. So a lot of times they're showing a George reaction where he looks kind of annoyed or whatever, but I take that with a grain of salt.
Yep.
The thing with me for the India was Paul kept kind of saying like, oh, we weren't really being ourselves there, which is weird to me because like, you know, they're there and they weren't thinking about who they were being. And George tried to say this, but he said it in probably even more convoluted than I'm about to try to explain it. You know, they're there, they're relaxing, they're doing a bunch of drugs, like they are being themselves. I think it's almost like Paul was kind of trying to say we should have been more the Beatles when we were there, rather than these random dudes like in India learning the culture and writing songs. Like I think Paul wanted them to treat India more like a work thing, whereas they ended up treating it more like a vacation.
Well, I see what you're saying there for sure, because I think when they went to India, it was all under like the tutelage of the Maharishi, and it was like he talks a bit about how it was like school, and it was like, you know, he was the headmaster, and which is interesting because both Paul and George went to a Liverpool all boys school, so they know very well what this is like. That like whenever they wanted to sneak off or like do drugs or whatever they were doing, it was like you can't, you know, let the Maharishi know. You know, so I think that's kind of a part of what he's referring to is like
Okay.
it is like the Maharishi was kind of like their headmaster, telling them, you know, you can't do that or you can't do this, or you know, you must, you know, meditate this many times a day or whatever. And I think they kind of, Jake, like, do you kind of see what I'm saying here, where they got to a point where it's like, oh, this isn't us, like, you know, at least that's how I think how Paul viewed it. That it was it went a little too far, and I think that's kind of what he's saying.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I saw that.
Yeah, like where George, but I feel like where George is so into the Hare Krishna and the Hinduism of it all, that I think he's a little like, what do you mean? Like you didn't like believe any of it? You were just like playing along? I think it's kind of where he's
Okay.
coming from. You know, where Paul doesn't say that. He kind of like corrects him and says like, no, I totally understand where you're coming from. But he's like, when we're there, it was like a little like not, we weren't being true to ourselves is basically what I think he's saying.
Okay. And there was actually a scene at the very start of the episode when they were still at Twickenham when George wasn't there. And I think Paul and I think it was Paul and Ringo were kind of making fun of George for the Hare Krishna thing after they got those flowers. And they're kind of like, you know, I wish those guys weren't around here. Like, you know, I honestly, the most I know about Hare Krishna is outside of George Harrison is there was like a Mad Men plot line about it. Like, you know, I know it was big in the 60s. So.
Yeah, like I don't think they actually tell us who sent those flowers, but it's really, I love how much they crack up about that, where like they're like, oh, flowers for George Harrison. And I feel like that's something maybe John did or something like that, because I don't know, it's so funny. Like it's such a, like, you know, you know, they knew he wasn't gonna be there. so,
Yeah.
they sent a card, you know, just to kind of like, I think, break the tension, because I think somebody knew that there was going to be tension there, you know. Maybe it was George himself, who knows, but I don't think they ever say who sent the flowers.
I think Ringo said it was the Hare Krishnas.
Yeah, the Hare Krishna sent it.
Oh, it was the George's friends that were in
that's
the
what I
first
mean.
episode. Like,
yeah,
okay.
So that's what I mean. So then they kind of made jokes about that after, but like how they kind of thought it was weird that those guys were always hanging around. Like there's obviously like a little, like, I don't know, George seems like he's kind of the oddball that they sort of make fun of him sometimes for what he does. And I think that contributes to the tension.
Yeah, like, and they're kind of making fun of his religion, which is, you know, in some ways a personal thing. Like in a lot of ways, it's that's what he believes, and that's, you know, let him do his thing, you know. And I think where John bought in the India stuff, where, you know, when they went, and then I think he, like, I don't know, the spell was broken from the Maharishi on him. I think something happened. I don't know exactly. Like, I don't know if you know, Jake, but like there's this whole moment where John kind of is like, no, this guy's kind of a fraud, you know. And that's why, like, that's the whole Sexy Sadie song is about that. And, you know, that there's no more Maharishi after they go to India, so something occurred where they were like, this guy is, not on the up and up.
Yeah, no, I saw, yeah, definitely there was something going on there that we'll probably never know about. But I guess the thing, that whole India thing was kind of a mystery of really what kind of went down. I'm sure there was a lot of like weird stuff happening.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the studio where,
no pun intended.
Right. Where the other thing I thought was really interesting about this documentary too, especially in this episode, how much Glyn John, I don't know if you know who that guy, I'm sure you do, Jake, because you're a big Who and Zeppelin fan, but
yeah,
he's like basically the producer of this album. Yet
he's the sound engineer.
Yeah, but they just call him the sound engineer. He's, because what ends up happening with this album is a lot of the tapes get leaked. I don't know if you guys knew that. So like Get Back and a lot of of their songs get leaked somehow, which I wonder how that occurs, like, and who gets in trouble for that. But Glyn John seemed like he was going to be the producer of this album, and then they gave it to Phil Spector after it got leaked because they wanted to redo it and then kind of change it so like the leaked versions weren't the same. What did you make of Glyn John in this documentary, Jake, and how he his dynamic with the band? Because we don't get to see George Martin, which he's the famous producer. Even though he's there, he's not really producing.
Yeah, it's weird. I like you said, like you don't really see George Martin that much when it seems like he was such a big part of the band in this period. Like especially with Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, he was kind of the orchestrator of everything. But yeah, with Glyn, he seems like he obviously has a good relationship with the band because they always seem to be kind of having their back and forths, kind of making fun of each other.
Yeah.
He helps with writing the songs and stuff too, which I thought was cool. Like in the first episode,
and he plays on some of the albums too.
Yeah, like Paul's coming up with "Let It Be," and I think he's the one who like tells him, "Oh, you should do like that. You should do that extra little part with the piano at the end." Like I thought that was cool. I don't mean to interrupt there, but like yeah, like it's weird because Glyn came up with like several versions of this album, which I guess were rejected. And then Phil Spector ends up coming out with the one with the orchestra and changing it. And that's the one that gets released. And it got released to not very good critical reception. So,
yeah. Yeah. And so like, there's also the moment in the first episode, Josh, where I think they're working on, Don't Let Me Down, and like they're like, oh, you like, and they're going through the melodies and the harmonies, and he's like, why don't you sing it, the first line, you sing the second line, and you all sing the third line together,
yeah,
that kind of stuff, but he would go on, I think, like right after this to go produce Zeppelin 1, yeah. So he's a very prolific producer in the history of rock and roll music. Still alive. I actually went to the premiere of this, so a super interesting guy to listen to. We also have, okay, so at the end of this episode, they kind of get to the point where they start talking about this idea of, okay, well, like, what can we do, a big spectacular payoff for this movie, because it's going to be a movie now, not a TV special. And I don't know, I think kind of the coolest moment of this episode for me is when they walk up to Paul and they tell him the idea to do it on the roof.
Yeah, his face lights up.
Yeah, oh yeah, his face is like, oh, like the light bulb goes off, and he, did you kind of see what I'm saying there, Jake? Like, is that kind of like to be like, well,
yeah,
you?
That was right after moments. That was right after his speech where he was like, where's the payoff? Like, are we just making another album after another album after another album? Yeah. And they say, hey, you can go up on the roof and play. And he's like, oh, that's something. Like, that's something interesting. That's something different.
Oh, and one thing I like, because you were talking earlier about Glyn John and how he goes on to be like a big deal. At one point in the episode, they point out that the guy who's like operating the tape machine is Alan Parsons. Did you guys catch that?
Yep.
And I was like, what? Because I know he was an engineer on Abbey Road, but literally he's working as like a lackey, like changing tapes when they're doing this entire thing, and that's so cool, right? Like
Dr. Evil's master plan. The Alan Parsons
Exactly.
Project.
So sorry again. That's something I wanted to mention on the podcast. Like that's crazy that they have all this talent in the room, and it ends up being again what was considered at the time not a great album.
Alan Parsons also, like, he was working on them with even Sergeant Pepper, at the same time working with Pink Floyd on Saucer, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So like he was like all round EMI at that time. So yeah, he was just like a lackey though. It's kind of crazy how you're right. How many
They just showed like Alan Parsons tape operator, like, or something like that in the documentary. Like they don't explain anything. It's like a little Easter egg almost the way they did it in this.
Okay. There's one thing I want to ask you guys about the rooftop thing, because okay, so they get this idea to go up onto the roof and they're scouting it out here at the end of the episode. Now, at the same time, only a few like minutes before, they're talking about Martin Luther King and that he would have, his whole I Have a Dream speech, and it was like this huge giant poem who had just been assassinated like, only a few months before that. Kennedy had been assassinated 6 months before that, and then also Bobby Kennedy. What are they thinking? Doing a rooftop concert, open air, right? Like, I mean, like, I guess the difference is it's in England,
Yeah.
But
yeah,
well, and also
they're not gonna.
And it's completely unannounced, and it's completely unannounced, and it's not like like them playing a concert in the open air would be even probably more dangerous because they know people know when it is. They have a clear line of sight, I guess you could say. But yeah, also being in England, I guess they're not too concerned.
Yeah,
it's not like there's going to be time for someone to plan to kill them. Like they're doing it like 4 days later.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key. You're right that it was not, only a few people would have even known about it. But at the same time, I don't know. Like, I guess that's just they didn't probably think about it. Like it probably didn't even really cross their minds because I think of those things you just said that was in England and it was spontaneous and nobody would have seen it coming. Who's going to plan? And how many people have a rifle in downtown London?
Also, I know this is like obviously in hindsight not true, but they were probably like, who would want to assassinate a random like Beatles person?
Yeah.
We're not a politician. It's not like some crazy guy with Catcher in the Rye is going to show up.
Yeah, like, and we're about, 41 years ago. In a couple days, it will be, the anniversary of John Lennon's assassination. So like we have all this kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of going through my mind when they're scouting out the rooftop concert. I'm like, are they kind of like, did they even think about this? Like, did somebody say to them, like, wait a minute, guys?
I bet it didn't enter anyone's mind.
Yeah. It probably
at the time they didn't think about it. Like it wouldn't have been a thing. Like it's like, oh, we're just musicians. Like we're not activists. We're not politicians.
Even though at the same time, like, John's doing a lot of his like, bed piece and stuff. Or maybe that was this year. Maybe that was actually after this when he started doing all that, the Montreal bed in. I think that might have been in 1969, but he might have done it. He might have done one earlier. I don't know. I have to look at the dates of that, but yeah. Anyway, yeah, but they definitely have a message, but yeah, they're not as like, I don't think they look at themselves as influential as a Martin Luther King Jr.
No, as Martin Luther King in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, like you're a bit of a target, like.
Yeah.
Well, and okay, so before we move on, I do want to kind of comment on Peter Jackson's some of the stuff he was doing in this episode. Like I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan because I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the India footage earlier, and I kind of felt like maybe he included the India footage to set up when later on Paul's using like a kind of mock Indian voice when he's singing. I think he was singing "Get Back" for a bit in a voice. So he's trying to couch that, and then I think bringing up the Martin Luther King stuff and showing that footage was again trying to show the progressiveness of the Beatles, and then they bring in like a black person to play piano. Like I think it's part of the narrative at the same time. Like, I'm not making a political statement or anything. I like that Peter Jackson sort of making these little stories throughout the episode. And I think that's why he did that, because it's probably just a few throwaway lines where they're talking about Martin Luther King there.
I definitely think that you're right about his editing choices, that he definitely wants to set up certain things and make you think about certain things as he's going along in the story here. But
Yeah.
I and I agree with you that he's definitely, apparently this took 4 years just to remaster and like basically make it HD. So if you're going through all that time of 4 years, you're gonna constantly be editing it and constantly figuring out, oh, this should go here, that should go here. And I just like the amount of attention and care that he put into this documentary.
Yeah.
It definitely shows. Peter Jackson for me is like a hit and miss guy. Like, I mean, the Lord of the Rings stuff, like I like Lord of the Rings, but it's not like my favorite thing. I know you love it, Josh. Some of his I really love the World War I documentary that he made, which also took 4 years.
Yeah, They Shall Not Grow Old. Great movie.
Yeah, awesome. And so for me, all that stuff's great. But like, King Kong and stuff, I get like the one thing I appreciate about him is everything he does, he is genuinely interested in. He won't do anything that's like, oh, I'll do it for a paycheck, so that, but like the Hobbit movies, like those are tough for me to go. I've tried watch them. They're tough for me.
Okay, but I've got to defend the guy. He got really put in a bad position there. He had a tougher time with the Hobbit movies than the Beatles had trying to put out this album,
right?
Because he had Guillermo del Toro leave the project, and he basically came in partway through and had to salvage it. And the studio also forced him to make it a trilogy. And I think he's realized, though, now that trilogies work, because I don't know if you guys noticed, but he made this Get Back documentary into a trilogy.
He did, and originally I think he wanted to make it like 1 6-hour thing, but they were like, "No, break it up into 3 episodes," which is smart. Okay, all right. Anything else here, guys? That that popped out in your mind, Jake? Anything you want to kind of mention?
One of the kind of interesting things I remember from this episode is probably the very end when they're rehearsing "Let It Be."
Yep.
And they're just getting completely buckled. They're just like downing drinks. I don't even know what they're drinking, but they're just, by the end, they're just hammered. And you can tell Paul, he's slurring his words. He's giving them instructions. And he doesn't even know what he's saying. And then they just keep playing and playing and playing and playing. And that's kind of the end of the episode, which I thought was interesting. Whereas they perfect that in, the next week or two.
Right. I mean, I really like that stuff too, because it just goes to show, like, they weren't always like workaholics. They were, even when they were partying, though, they're working, but it was never like always serious, which I think a lot of people always kind of thought about the Beatles, that they couldn't, like, have fun. Josh, anything else you kind of want to bring up quick here that hasn't been mentioned yet?
I think I did most of it in my last few little interruptions. I think the biggest thing that stood out to me in this episode was, I've never been a big John Lennon guy. I've always been a Paul guy, and he was like really funny. Like he was the jokester of the group, which I never really would have thought. And I really like this episode really showcased that and showed his sort of role. Like he's making his jokes all the time. Your host for the evenings is the Rolling Stones. Like he said that like 14 times, and it was hilarious. I really liked seeing the John stuff in this episode.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's the second episode. It's basically like Disney Plus put out like a John Lennon like stand-up special. Like it's the whole episode of him just being a complete goofball.
Yeah, it was awesome. I loved it.
The one thing, like I think, John is definitely for me like the funniest. Like I think Paul has the most talent, funny wise. Like he can do all these crazy voices, but John's like wit is definitely unmatched by the rest of them. Like he's always quick, and he's all like, there's the whole moment with Glyn Johns where it's like, Ringo, do you have a damper on your bass drum? He's like, the only damper around here is you, Glyn. Like all that kind of stuff.
Or he's like, John, can you turn on the bass on your guitar? And he's just like,
yeah, like it's not as good. Now it's not bassy, stuff like that. Like he had a great way, it seems like, of being funny but getting his point across at the same time, which I don't know, he seems like a really cool guy.
No, for sure. Like that's why I think it's funny. We were just talking about his assassination, and I think one of the things that Mark David Chapman has said is he didn't like the whole "we're more popular than Jesus" line, like the famous line. Yeah. And watching this, if you didn't already realize it, like John was joking and people just took it way too seriously. Like he's a funny guy and he thought that was a funny line, and it ended up causing so many problems for the Beatles and him.
I think it was definitely like an off the cuff remark. Then once he had to start kind of like defending it, he was like, you know what, it's actually true. He's like, there is something kind of wrong with the fact that like more people are in to us than religion or good things. I think that was kind of also the point he was making, but people didn't want to hear it. Jake, anything to say on that one?
Yeah, I think that's like, I even think it was during a press conference and he was asked like a question about like, oh, you guys are so famous now, how do you deal with all this attention? He's like, yeah, we're bigger than Jesus now. Like, it was a completely off the cuff kind of funny comment that was just taken completely out of context.
Yeah, and then just became this. You know what? The one thing I really noticed about that was how much things have not changed since the 60s. Like the way the media deals with popular figures, like, you said what? And it just becomes like this crazy viral thing, and nobody really listens to the context of it. It's just on face value, and like that's really, we still do that today. Like there's there's way more of it today than there was back then, it seems like, but it's still a constant that didn't change. Go ahead, Josh.
There was that line where, because John was kind of complaining this whole episode about how he was kind of sick, and then he made a line about, oh, I've got the Hong Kong flu. And I looked up what that was, and there's literally like a mini pandemic in 1968 called the Hong Kong flu, which was like H2N4 or something. And again, things never change. We're literally living through a pandemic right now, and it's been given like names after Asian places before. Like, it's just crazy how at times they stay the same. History
repeats itself. It definitely it's the one thing that, like, Dave said it last week, Josh, that like, we when we were growing up, we're all around the same age. Like, I always kind of like looked at the 60s, and Dave said this too, that it was like this time a long, long time ago, and it was like a generation we'll never understand, and it was a people in a time that like we look back at with like rose-colored glasses, literally. And the one thing I really, really like about this documentary is like, actually, it's pretty much the same. It's not that different than today, and we look at it the wrong way through a weird lens that I don't think is necessarily true. These are just, at the end of the day, these are four people in a room playing music, and if you could do the same thing today, and it wouldn't be that different. I
completely agree. That's exactly. Like, I mean, the 60s seem a long time ago, but when we were little kids, they were the same distance as the 90s are to us now. You know what I mean? Like, it's and people are gonna do the same thing with the 90s. They already do. 90s kids, stuff like that. Like, it's everyone's the same. We're all the same.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Life goes on within you and without you, as George would say.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything we have to say about this episode, guys. Join us next week, everyone. So when we cover the final episode, the rooftop concert, I think is what part 3 is mainly going to cover. Jake, you've already watched it. Anything, a little preview, a little tease maybe for the audience?
I think the coolest part in episode 3 is the editing choices that Peter Jackson made for the rooftop concert. Pretty much the entire thing is either like 4 screens. It's showing different camera angles. It's showing, from the street. It's showing people's on the street reaction. It's really, really interesting, and it's all in real time that they show it. So it's really, really cool. It's basically awesome. The whole last hour of the 3rd episode. Yeah.
Cool. No, I'm looking forward to watching it. So join us next week for that. I think that's really exciting. We also have a whole bunch of other shows here on this channel, which is Super Matos Bros Podcasting, where we cover Survivor on Wednesday nights. Jake, Josh, have you guys been watching the most recent season of Survivor?
Oh, we watch it every Wednesday.
And what have you guys made of this season, real quick?
I think it's probably one of the worst seasons in the history of Survivor, because of the fact that Jeff Probst is throwing out all these crazy new twists, and none of the players use them or do anything with them. They just don't happen. Like
the do or die
and I
at
think
7 was I didn't get, but
yeah, they threw in a lot of stuff that's like they threw a lot of stuff at the wall, and a lot of it isn't sticking. And I just think the cast is really kind of boring and unlikable. Like there's no one really that you're kind of rooting for. Like
they voted out all the cool people in the first first 5 episodes.
That's how I felt about it too. Like in our draft, I drafted Deshaun and Erica, and I'm like, I don't really know if either of them have a chance of winning. But this whole season, the way they've edited it has definitely changed the way we view the show, which that part's interesting, but I don't know for the better. So join us for that. We also cover a lot of Marvel stuff on this channel. I think they're going to be doing Hawkeye coming up soon. Dave Mader, my brother. So join us for that. And then also on our Star Trek channel, we have Live Long and Podcast, where we do a whole host of shows. On Tuesdays, I do Deep Space Nine at 9ish, where we cover Deep Space Nine. We're on season 4 right now. We're almost through it, so we're getting to the really good stuff of Deep Space Nine. On Mondays, today, I believe they just started up a new podcast. They are doing Enterprise. It's been a long road getting from here to there. But they're covering it, I think, somewhat reluctantly. But if you really, really love Star Trek Enterprise, which it's a select few people, watch that. On this weekend, I think. No, is it this weekend? No, next weekend. We will be doing another version of Star Trek Radio Theater. I don't have the poster. If Dave was here, he would show us. We will be doing Star Trek First Contact. Yes, we have a huge cast for that. So this is where basically Star Trek Radio Theater is. We get the script from a TV show of Star Trek or a movie, and we read it out as if we're the actors. And it's basically all theater of the mind. And it's really a lot of fun. So if that's something that interests you, check that out. It's fun to just throw it on when you're doing work or driving somewhere.
It's like an audiobook.
It's basically like an audiobook. If you don't want to watch the movie, you just want to listen to the movie, and we do fun, wacky voices. It's great for that. Also in Star Trek Radio Theater. It's our Live Long and Podcast. Am I missing one, Josh? Oh no, they are covering Discovery. Yes.
There's Joe. Yeah, and then there's also Jody's podcast, that Trivial Debates podcast.
We also have Trivial Debates. Trivial Debates is basically it's a trivial debate format where basically a host comes up with 6 questions and 3 different contestants give their answers, and they debate it to see who is the most right according to the host. So check that out. We do that once a month, usually at the end of the month, the last Sunday of every month. So check that out. I think the most recent episode is up, where they had 3 different contestants from 3 different countries. So that was very exciting. Yeah. And I think that's it. Also, Joe, Davin Skellhorn, our second cousin, Dave and I's second cousin, he has a podcast called Locutors of Trek. So check that out. That's another Star Trek podcast. Yes, we're hitting you hard with the Star Trek content here. He does all sorts of different shows. One called Debate 9. So he has a whole bunch of different ones where they just talk about Star Trek more from like a philosophical viewpoint, and they look at it that way and have a great discussion. So check them out. We also have my nephew Eamon Mader. He has a podcast called Let's Talk About Fighting Games, where he talks all about fighting video games. So if you're a big video game nerd, that is the podcast for you. And I think that is it. So join us next week. Josh Shields, thank you for joining us here on the second episode of Get Back, the Beatles podcast. We will be here same time, 9:30 Monday next week, to cover part 3, the rooftop concert. For all of us here at Super Mader Rose Podcast, I've been your host, Jeff Mader. We will see you next week. Get back.